"Let me stay," Serena said. "I'll raise your children." Elias Baird stared at the stranger beyond his doorway. Behind him, milk burned on the stove. Smoke curled through the room. One child screamed against his shoulder while the other clawed at his shirt. He looked like a man who could pull a full-grown steer from the mud but could not quiet two frightened children. Serena Holt had come to Black Juniper Ranch, seeking nothing more than water, directions, and one night's shelter before the September cold settled in. Instead, she found a widowed rancher losing a fight no strength could win. "May I?" she asked. Elias hesitated, then handed her Elsie. Serena lifted the child against her chest, supported her head, and walked across the porch. The crying weakened, then stopped. Elias looked from his sleeping daughter to Ethan, still red-faced in his arms. "What do you want?" Serena glanced at the smoke, the fading fields, and the wind of autumn. "A place by the fire," she said, "and food at the table." No bargain was struck. Elias silently stepped back, letting her in. His acceptance came not from trust, but from the profound exhaustion of a man who had fought alone for far too long. Black Juniper Ranch had not fallen apart overnight. It had been wearing down for 11 quiet months. Martha Baird died when Ethan and Elsie were barely 2 months old. What began as a fever looked no worse than the colds she had survived before. The nearest doctor lived too far away, and Elias waited one day too long. By the time help arrived, she was beyond saving. After that, he became father, mother, rancher, carpenter, and bookkeeper all at once. The children were fed, but little more. The north bedroom remained locked. Martha's handwritten labels still hung from the food bins, untouched. Fires burned through too much wood. Empty rooms stayed heated. Elias often fell asleep in a chair with one baby on his chest. Serena understood that kind of silence. Her husband had died beneath an overturned logging wagon 2 years earlier. Afterward, she worked on a homestead until the owner sold the land. She arrived at Black Juniper with very few belongings and no certain place to go next. They had not met by chance. They met because life had left them both with nowhere else to go. Elias did not accept her offer right away. "What do you know about children?" he asked. Serena never claimed to know everything. She simply said she had cared for babies on isolated homesteads, helped her mother assist with difficult births, and learned from her father how to recognize hunger, cold, and troubled breathing before they became dangerous. "I can't pay you," Elias said. "I'm not asking for wages," Serena replied. "A roof, a warm meal, and a place that won't turn me away before the snow comes." She mixed fresh milk for the twins, changed their diapers, washed their faces, and settled them side by side in a wider cradle. Ethan fussed for a while. Elsie fell asleep. Elias watched her finish one task before beginning the next. Finally, he nodded. "If the children don't settle, or if you give me reason not to trust you, you'll leave before the first heavy snow closes the road." She accepted without bargaining. He gave her a small room beside the kitchen. "The papers, the north bedroom, and the barn are off limits." Serena simply nodded. That night, she lay awake, listening to the wind slip through the house like water through a woven basket. Serena rose before sunrise on her first full day. The fire had already burned down to ash, yet 3 empty rooms still stood open, quietly pulling what little warmth remained away from the children. Ethan and Elsie slept in separate cradles across the room from the stove. Cold air drifted along the floor. Every morning, Elsie woke with the same light cough. Serena did not begin by sealing cracks. She changed the way the family lived inside the house. The table moved closer to the stove. The cradles followed. Old blankets were hung from simple wooden poles, creating a smaller winter room with a still layer of air between cloth and wall. Unused rooms were closed. Rolled cloth blocked the gaps beneath their doors. Elias returned to find half the house rearranged. Instead of arguing, Serena set 2 pots of warm water down, one inside the new space, and one just outside the hanging blankets. 4 hours later, only the pot inside was still warm. 4 days later, the woodpile lasted longer. The twins slept deeper. Elias never praised her. He simply left everything where she had put it. That silent concession was a good start, but a high-country winter was not easily defeated by a few suspended blankets. The biting chill patiently sought to test new boundaries. Even the winter room could not stop cold air from circling beneath the cradles. Serena built something smaller. Using pine boards from an old shipping crate, worn wool felt, and clean straw packed inside cloth sacks, she made a three-sided sleeping frame around the twins' cradles. The babies never touched the straw. The top remained open. That first night, Ethan slept longer than he had in weeks. The next morning, Serena pressed her hand against the inside of the felt. It was damp. The baby's own breath had become trapped inside. She dismantled part of the frame before breakfast. Elias watched in silence. "So it doesn't work," he said. "It doesn't work yet," Serena answered. She lowered the front panel, opened 2 narrow vents near the top, replaced every damp lining, and moved the frame farther from the stove so heat would spread more evenly. The second night, she checked the felt 3 different times. By morning, it was dry. Elsie never coughed once. Watching the discarded boards beside the wall, Elias understood something important. Serena cared more about the children than she cared about proving herself right. While preparing breakfast, Serena noticed a potato with a long white sprout curling toward a crack of light. She carried it into the cellar. The problem was never just one potato. More had turned soft around their eyes. Onions felt damp beneath their skins. Winter squash wore small patches of mold around their stems. Apples had been stacked so closely that one bruised fruit had spoiled 4 others. Cornmeal had hardened into heavy lumps. A sack of dried beans resting against the wall carried a faint sour smell. Elias frowned. "My grandfather lived through winters with worse." Serena cut the potato in half and showed him the pale flesh already breaking down beneath the sprout. Then she lifted a storage crate. Moisture darkened the boards underneath. She found 3 small labels tied to the bins in Martha's handwriting. "Use first. Keep dry." For the babies, Serena carefully wiped away the dust, but left every word untouched. She simply wrote the inspection date on the back. Everything spoiled was separated at once. Everything's sound was sorted by how long it could safely last. Watching the growing pile outside, Elias stiffened. "You're throwing away our winter." Serena quietly shook her head. "No, winter started taking it long before I opened this door." Serena refused to store every crop the same way. Potatoes were spread in shallow layers and kept in darkness without washing. Onions and garlic were hung where the air stayed dry. Carrots and turnips were trimmed and packed in barely damp sand. Winter squash rested on wooden slats instead of the floor. Sound apples were wrapped one by one. Cornmeal and dried beans were moved into covered chests raised above the ground. That afternoon, Amos Treadwell, an aging ranch hand who had worked neighboring spreads for decades, stopped by to repair a broken gate. He found Serena pulling storage bins away from the wall. He almost laughed. He was about to tell her that the cellar had survived plenty of winters without anyone needing to fuss over it. But when Serena lifted a crate and showed him the wet underside, Amos stopped arguing. He reached down and touched the damp wood himself. He said nothing after that. Instead, he helped build slatted shelves and narrow walkways between the bins. A few days later, Serena discovered her own mistake. The sand around the carrots had been too wet. Several roots had turned slimy near the tops. She emptied the box, discarded every spoiled carrot, dried the sand, and packed the rest again. "Going to hide that from Elias?" Amos asked. Serena brushed the dirt from her hands. "Food doesn't care who's right," she said. "It only keeps spoiling while pride argues." By the end of the second week, the house followed a different rhythm. Serena rose before dawn each morning. She checked the sleeping box, stirred the fire back to life, and cooked soft cornmeal porridge for the twins. With the children settled, Elias could spend full mornings repairing fences instead of rushing back to the house every hour. Amos no longer had to stop his work just to rock a crying baby. Ethan had begun pulling himself upright against a chair. Elsie's cough had nearly disappeared. One afternoon, Elias returned from the pasture and stopped outside the winter room. He heard laughter. Serena hid a wooden spoon beneath her apron, then made it appear again. Ethan burst into delighted giggles. Elsie stared at her brother for a heartbeat before joining him. It was the first time Elias had heard both children laugh since Martha died. A few moments later, Elsie crawled into the hallway and rested her tiny hand against the locked north bedroom door. Serena never reached for the handle. Instead, she quietly asked if there might be a heavier blanket inside for the babies. That night, Elias stood outside the door for a long time. The following morning, he placed the key on the kitchen table without a word. When they entered together, Serena waited. She let Elias step into Martha's room first. The north bedroom looked as though time had stopped the day Martha died. Her shawl still hung behind the door. A pair of sewing scissors rested beside a spool of thread. Folded across the foot of the bed lay a wool blanket with its border only half-stitched. Dust covered everything, but nothing had been disturbed. Serena never reached for Martha's clothes. Only after Elias gave a quiet nod did she pick up the unfinished blanket. On the bedside table rested a small notebook. Inside, Martha had carefully recorded the family's weekly use of flour, dried beans, potatoes, firewood, and lamp oil. She had even detailed which of the hardiest potatoes to save as seed, drawing a clear line between winter meals and next year's harvest. Serena studied the pages without carrying the notebook away. Though there were still plenty of blank pages inside, she gently closed it. Serena had no desire to let her own handwriting intrude upon the final marks Martha had left behind. Outside the kitchen, she hung a small charcoal board. Weekly firewood allowance, lamp oil used, days of flour remaining, nothing more. She kept Martha's system alive, but left the past strictly untouched. Elias watched quietly. "She always said a house didn't need more things," he finally murmured. "It only needed everything in the right place." Serena smiled softly. She was right. For the first time since Serena had arrived, Martha was no longer spoken of as the woman who had died. She was remembered as the woman who had built a system worth preserving. That evening, Serena tucked the unfinished blanket over Ethan and Elsie. Before folding it around them, she carefully turned the loose edge inward so the unfinished stitches would never brush against their skin. By early November, the west wind had found the house. Each cold morning, a thin ring of frost formed around the heads of the nails driven through the north wall. Serena touched one with her fingertip, then another farther down the room. Both were colder than the surrounding wood. She did not have enough lumber to build another wall. Instead, she chose several dry hay bales that had lost too much color and nutrition to be worth feeding pregnant cows, but were still clean and dry. She stacked them outside the windward wall, leaving a narrow air gap between the hay and the cabin. Flat stones lifted the lowest bales off the ground. A worn canvas sheet was stretched across the top at a gentle angle so melting snow would drain away instead of soaking into the stack. That afternoon, Hollis Red, a neighboring rancher, stopped by to discuss cattle prices with Elias. He stared at the strange wall and laughed. "Looks like she's feeding the house instead of the cows." Elias said nothing. 3 days later, Serena discovered one corner had been stacked too low. Meltwater had dampened the bottom bale. Without arguing, she pulled 3 bales apart, raised the stone base, and rebuilt the corner. Hollis happened to ride past again. "I told you the whole idea was foolish." Serena answered only with a hammer. She drove 2 identical iron nails into opposite sides of the cabin. The next freezing morning, the nail behind the hay wall carried only a faint trace of frost. The nail on the exposed wall glittered white. She never pointed it out. Elias noticed it himself. That evening, he quietly carried another load of flat stones and placed them beside her work. He still could not bring himself to apologize, but for the first time, he helped build instead of standing aside. The first snowfall came early. It melted under 2 days of weak sunshine, then froze solid when the temperature dropped again. The old snow clung to the shallow kitchen roof, Fresh snow settled on top of it instead of sliding away. Serena noticed the signs before anyone else did. At night, the roof beams answered the cold with quiet creaks. A pantry door that had always swung freely began scraping across the floor. Every hard gust shook a little dust loose from the joints above the stove. Elias barely looked up. "That roof has carried 20 winters," he said. "It'll carry one more." Serena never argued. She asked Amos to help build a long snow rake from 2 straight lodgepole poles, a light wooden crosspiece, and a rope brace. Standing safely on the ground, they pulled away the old snow a little at a time. They never stripped one side clean before touching the other. The weight had to leave the roof evenly. Elias frowned as they spent half the morning working on something that had not yet failed. Serena pointed quietly toward the pantry door, then toward the slight dip beside the stovepipe. "The roof is speaking," she said. "We just haven't learned to listen." They continued until the hardened lower layers were gone. By the next afternoon, the pantry door rubbed less against the floor. The frame had relaxed. Amos brushed the snow from his gloves and looked at Elias. "She isn't clearing snow because she's afraid of winter," he said. "She's clearing it because the timber has already started answering the load." Elias lifted his eyes to the rafters he had raised with his own hands years before. For the first time, he understood that a roof did not wait until it collapsed to tell its owner something was wrong. Sometimes, it whispered first. The wise listened while there was still time. One evening, while gathering firewood, Serena told Elias about a ranch hand she had once known. The man had been less than 50 yards from his own barn when a whiteout swallowed the valley. He walked in circles until the cold finished what the storm had begun. "He knew every inch of that ranch," she said quietly. "He just couldn't see any of it." The next morning, she proposed stretching a guide rope from the back porch to the woodshed, then on to the barn. Elias shook his head. "No one gets lost in their own yard." Serena looked toward the open pasture. "Could you find the barn with your eyes closed?" she asked, while the wind was pushing snow into your face. He had no answer. Amos helped drive tall lodgepole stakes into the frozen ground. The rope was tied at waist height with large knots spaced far enough apart to be counted through heavy gloves. A second line branched toward the woodshed. Every stake stood well above the deepest snow they normally expected. When Hollis rode by, he laughed again. "Looks like black juniper needs a leash." Serena kept pulling the rope tight. A week later, a heavy fog settled across the ranch before sunrise. After finishing chores, Amos reached for the guide rope and followed it back toward the house. When he finally stepped onto the porch, he looked behind him and realized he had drifted nearly 10 paces away from the invisible footpath before finding the line. That evening, Elias tested it himself. He walked from the porch to the barn after dark, with one gloved hand resting on the rope. When he returned, he said only one thing: "The middle post needs another brace." Serena tied a strip of faded blue cloth from her old dress around the first knot nearest the porch. Even in darkness, home would always have a beginning. The first week of December brought a closed carriage instead of snow. When Elias saw the 2 small trunks strapped behind it, he knew why his mother-in-law had come before she stepped onto the porch. Beatrice Crowell had buried her daughter 11 months earlier. She had no intention of losing her grandchildren as well. After greeting no one, she went straight to Ethan and Elsie. She checked their hands, their faces, their breathing. She watched them eat. She examined their neatly mended clothes. That night, she quietly stood outside the winter room and listened until both children fell asleep without coughing. Only then did she turn to Serena. "Do you believe you've become their mother?" Serena answered without hesitation. "No." She looked toward the north bedroom. "They already have one. Her name is still written all over this house." Beatrice entered the cellar next. Every label still carried Martha's handwriting. The inspection dates had been added neatly to the back, never over the original words. Potatoes, onions, squash, dried beans, and seed potatoes for spring had all been sorted with care. She searched for proof that Serena had erased her daughter's place. She found none. Instead, she found Martha's work still being honored. Even so, her decision did not change. After Christmas, she said, Ethan and Elsie would leave with her. Serena had earned respect, but respect was not the same as family. As Serena watched the two small trunks sitting beside the carriage, she realized they were just large enough to carry everything two little children owned. That evening, Beatrice asked Elias to step outside onto the back porch. The wind carried most of their voices away, but not all of them. "You've replaced Martha too quickly," Beatrice said. "You've brought a stranger into my daughter's home." Elias answered the way he always had. "Serena is only here temporarily." The words left his mouth. Then he heard them. For the first time, they sounded less like caution than cowardice. He looked back through the kitchen window. Serena was folding the twins' clothes while Ethan leaned against her leg, trying to stand. "No," Elias said quietly. "That's not true anymore." Beatrice waited. She didn't replace Martha. He paused before continuing. "Martha built this home. She organized the cellar. She filled every bin, every shelf, every room with care. Serena hasn't erased any of that." He looked toward the barn, then back at the house. "She's the reason it's still alive." Beatrice studied him for a long moment. "Do you love her?" she finally asked. "Or do you simply need her?" Elias did not answer the question she asked. "If Serena leaves," he said, "I won't just lose someone who watches the children. I'll lose the only person who's looked at Black Juniper as a family instead of a list of chores waiting to be finished." Inside the house, Serena caught only fragments through the thin wall. Still alive. A family. She lowered the tiny shirt she had been folding. Later that night, Beatrice agreed to remain until after the coming storms, instead of taking the twins immediately. When the house grew quiet, Elias found Serena beside the stove. "I should have spoken when Hollis mocked you," he said. "I was wrong." Serena looked at him calmly. "If you truly want me here," she replied, "stop calling this temporary whenever someone else is listening." She returned to folding the children's clothes. This time, she placed them carefully into the drawer instead of leaving them packed inside her travel bag. By the last week of January, the valley had grown strangely quiet. The barometer dropped. The horses turned their backs toward the western ridge hours before the wind arrived. Small birds vanished from the fences. Even the creek seemed quieter. Then the wind stopped altogether. For nearly half a day, nothing moved. That silence worried Serena more than any storm. Late that evening, a pale ring formed around the moon. She began checking every system one last time. The old snow had already been pulled from the roof. The guide rope was tightened between every post. The winter room was made even smaller to hold less air. Smooth river stones rested beside the stove, warming slowly for the night ahead. The calf-warming crate was lined with fresh burlap. Bundles of cottonwood branches, willow twigs, and dried corn stalks hung inside the barn as emergency fodder. Potatoes, squash, dried beans, and cornmeal were counted again. Belle, one of the older cows, was close to calving. Hollis stopped by before riding home. "The town says it'll just be another heavy snow," he said. Nothing more. He refused Serena's offer to move his youngest calves into better shelter. Beatrice watched Serena walk from one task to the next. Why prepare for a disaster that hasn't arrived? Serena tied one final knot in the guide rope. "Storms don't give people time to prepare," she said. "They reveal who already has." Before sunset, Elias asked Amos to stay the night. Then he turned towards Serena. For the first time, he did not ask whether she was certain. He asked something else. "What did we miss?" Serena looked toward the western horizon. Before she could answer, the wind changed direction. The storm arrived shortly after midnight. The first gust struck the north wall like a falling tree. Then another, then another. Powder snow forced itself into every crack it could find. Before dawn, the windows disappeared behind solid white. The ranch no longer had a horizon. The cabin groaned, but the hay wall shielded the windward side. Frost never formed around the protected nails the way it did on the exposed wall. Inside the winter room, the small pocket of warmth still surrounded the twins. The sleeping box stayed dry. The new vents carried away their breath without stealing their heat. The stovepipe drafted cleanly. Only the fire demanded constant feeding. Holding the guide rope with one gloved hand, Amos fought his way toward the woodshed. Within a few steps, the cabin vanished behind blowing snow. Without the rope, there would have been nothing to follow back. The kitchen roof accepted fresh snow, but the old weight had already been removed. The rafters still creaked. They did not sag. In the barn, Belle dropped to her knees. The calf was coming. Elias and Amos disappeared into the whiteout, one hand gripping the rope, the other shielding their faces from the wind. Nearly an hour passed. Then the guide rope trembled 3 times. Their signal: dry cloth, hot water. Serena wrapped warm river stones in heavy towels and placed them beneath a low wooden sled, making certain they never touched the children directly. Martha's unfinished blanket covered Ethan and Elsie. "We can't take the babies out there," Beatrice protested. "If the fire fails," Serena answered, "one person cannot protect both the house and the barn." She reached for the guide rope. After one brief hesitation, Beatrice placed her own hand behind Serena's. The path had disappeared. The rope remained. Belle's labor lasted far longer than anyone wanted. By the time the calf slipped onto the straw, she was exhausted. The little heifer lay still. Her coat was soaked. Her breathing came in, weak, uneven pulls. Every time the barn door opened, the wind drove another blast of snow across the floor. Elias had strained his shoulder, helping Belle through the delivery, yet he kept working without complaint. Serena pointed toward the warming crate they had built days earlier. Its floor stood above the frozen ground. Dry burlap lined the sides. Warm water crocks, wrapped in heavy cloth, rested beneath the bedding. Small vents near the top allowed damp air to escape without creating a draft.
"We have to get this calf dry.
"Dry her first," Serena said. Nothing else mattered until the water was gone. Beatrice knelt beside her and rubbed the calf with coarse towels until the wet hair fluffed instead of clinging to the skin. Amos stayed beside Belle, speaking softly while replacing fresh fodder from the emergency reserve. Elias changed the burlap whenever moisture collected inside the crate. An hour passed. The calf still could not stand. Serena lifted her out for a few moments and guided her close enough for Belle to smell and lick her. Then they returned her to the warmth before her body lost too much heat again. The crate was never meant to replace the mother. It was meant to buy time. Outside, snow piled against the side door. Inside, the older cattle chewed through the cottonwood branches and dried corn stalks they had stored weeks before, saving the best hay for Belle. Nearly 2 hours after birth, the calf tucked her legs beneath herself. She struggled, rose, stood for only a heartbeat, then collapsed gently against her mother's shoulder. "You saved her," Elias said quietly. Serena shook her head. "We only kept her alive long enough for her to begin saving herself." Beatrice rested one hand beneath the calf's head. It was the same steady touch Serena had used the day Elsie stopped crying. The storm entered its second day. Visibility had shrunk to almost nothing. Then the guide rope jerked hard. Once. Twice. Then it stayed tight. Elias and Amos pulled on heavy coats and stepped into the whiteout, each keeping one hand wrapped around the rope. They found Hollis clinging to the middle post, barely able to remain on his feet. 3 young calves huddled against him, trembling beneath a blanket stiff with ice. The barn beam gave way. Hollis gasped. The water trough disappeared under the drift. He had tried to reach Black Juniper by memory. Memory failed. The rope did not. They led Hollis and the calves back one careful step at a time. Inside the barn, he saw everything he had mocked, still doing its job. The roof still stood. The barn doors still opened. Belle's newborn calf was alive. The emergency fodder was already feeding the herd. The hay wall had kept the north side of the cabin free from heavy frost, and the rope he had called a leash had become the only road left in the valley. No one asked for an apology. Serena handed him a mug of warm water instead. "Amos," she said quietly, "bring more dry burlap." In the kitchen, supper simmered from the vegetables that had been sorted weeks earlier. Potatoes marked use first, winter squash, dried beans, and cornmeal now fed one more exhausted rancher and 3 frightened calves. Hollis studied the small charcoal board beside the cellar. How long will the food last? Serena glanced at the figures. Long enough, she answered, if nobody wastes it. For the first time since she had arrived at Black Juniper, Hollis simply nodded. He did not argue. He sat beside the fire, watching the frost-covered guide rope disappear through the doorway, unable to meet Serena's eyes. The wind finally died down after 3 long days and 2 nights. When daylight returned, Black Juniper looked buried under the snow almost up to its windowsills. But the cabin still stood firm. The barn still stood. Not a single child had suffered from smoke or the freezing cold. The cattle were exhausted but alive. Belle was peacefully nursing her calf. Down in the cellar, the food supply remained perfectly intact. Every single preparation had faced nature's ultimate test and survived. Instead of rushing out to inspect the damage, Beatrice stood quietly, watching Ethan and Elsie sleep soundly. The children were tucked under Martha's unfinished wool blanket, kept warm by the smooth river stones Serena had carefully wrapped. 2 women, one from the past, one in the present, had shielded the children together through the raging storm. On the table, a hot breakfast was served from the very supplies Martha had labeled and Serena had patiently preserved. The warmth from the stove comforted Elias, Amos, and a once arrogant neighbor. The house hadn't just survived the winter's wrath. It had bound them together as a true family, a place where no one was left behind. Standing beside the stove, Beatrice turned to Elias. I won't be taking Ethan and Elsie with me. Then she faced Serena. I came here believing you were trying to erase my daughter's memory. She gently touched the edge of the wool blanket. Now, I realize. You didn't replace her legacy. You used your own 2 hands to keep it alive. Outside, Hollis quietly walked along the hay wall. How high should these stones sit? He finally asked. And how far apart do you tie those knots so a gloved hand can still find them? Elias never answered for her. He simply smiled. Ask her, he said. It was her design. Several days after the storm, Beatrice unlocked the north bedroom one last time. She carried out Martha's unfinished wedding blanket and placed it gently into Serena's hands. I don't want you to replace her name, she said. I want this blanket to keep warming the people she loved. When Beatrice left for Sheridan, the 2 small trunks returned with her. They were empty. A week later, Elias found Serena standing in the same doorway where she had first asked for shelter. I owe you more than thanks, he said. Serena waited. I won't pretend Martha was never here. She always will be. She's part of these walls. He looked across the ranch. But you're the reason this place became a home again. He took a slow breath. I'm not asking you to stay because I need someone to raise my children. He smiled for the first time in many months. I'm asking you to stay because I want someone beside me when it's time to decide what we fix next. Serena looked at him, a rare, genuinely warm smile breaking through. You still have a habit of waiting until things break before you fix them, she teased gently. Her eyes grew serious, but kept their warmth. I'm not staying just to patch things up, Elias. I'm staying so we can build something that lasts. She glanced around the home, then softly answered him. Besides, I unpacked my travel bag a long time ago. Spring finally reached Black Juniper. Snow melted away from the hay wall. The damp bales were replaced, while the sound ones found new purpose as bedding. Hollis helped stretch another guide rope toward the well, without mentioning the jokes he had once made. In the garden, Serena planted the seed potatoes she had protected through the winter. Ethan and Elsie patted the loose soil with tiny hands. As Serena lifted Elsie from the muddy row, the little girl whispered, Ma, it might have been a word. It might have been only a sound. Elias heard it. He never corrected her. Black Juniper entered another growing season not untouched by loss, not free from hard work, but no longer living one day at a time. Because wisdom was never proven by surviving the easy seasons. It was proven by what remained standing after the storm had passed.